June 9, 1660. The Château de Saint-Jean-de-Luz, France. The ocean was whispering outside the palace walls, soft and endless, while inside, a girl sat trembling beneath the weight of a golden crown. She was only 15. Her name was Maria Theresa of Spain, and in less than an hour, she would become the Queen of France, and the wife of Louis XIV, the man history would later call the Sun King. But that night, she didn't feel like a queen. She felt like prey. The wedding had lasted for hours, all gold and incense and promises. Trumpets had screamed in triumph as the alliance between France and Spain was sealed, not with signatures but with her body. As darkness fell over the Basque coast, the palace transformed into a theater, and she, the main act, had no lines to say. They called it La Cérémonie du Coucher Royal, the royal bedding ceremony. It was not a private ritual between lovers. It was a public spectacle meant to prove a nation's honor through the virginity of a girl. The courtiers had already begun to gather in the bedchamber, whispering in silk and perfume. Dozens of eyes followed the servants as they unfolded sheets of white linen embroidered with the fleur-de-lis. Candles flickered in rows, reflected in mirrors that made the room look like an endless golden maze. The air reeked of wax and roses. Maria Theresa sat perfectly still. She had been trained for this moment since childhood, to smile, to curtsy, to remain silent even when her heart screamed. But nothing in her lessons had prepared her for this. Louis, 17 and restless, stood nearby with the confidence of a young god. His long black curls framed a face that seemed carved for admiration. He smiled politely, perhaps nervously, as the Duke of Montazier approached with a velvet cushion, upon it, the royal nightshirt. The crowd murmured when Louis began to undress. Not completely, just enough to display that the future of France was physically intact. Then came Maria Theresa's turn. Two ladies-in-waiting stepped forward, untying the golden ribbons at her shoulders, loosening her gown until the heavy brocade fell away like a second skin. The girl's breath caught as cold air hit her bare collarbones. The Queen Mother, Anne of Austria, watched closely, nodding in approval. The ritual was not about tenderness. It was about continuity. The Virgin had to be seen, blessed, and delivered into the royal bed under the eyes of witnesses. A priest murmured prayers in Latin as they led the couple to the bed. The curtains were drawn back, revealing sheets white as snow. The couple was ordered to lie down. The Duke of Montazier approached with a candle and inspected the bed one last time, the symbol of purity, about to be stained in the name of France. The courtiers applauded softly. "May God grant you many sons," the Queen Mother declared. Then, one by one, they filed out, leaving behind the echo of their whispers and the scent of burning wax. When the doors finally closed, Maria Theresa's hands were shaking so violently she hid them under the covers. Louis sat beside her, his voice low and uncertain. "Do not be afraid," he said, perhaps meaning it. But fear had already rooted itself in her chest, deep and unyielding. She had been told that her duty was sacred. That this moment would ensure peace between two kingdoms. Yet, as the candles burned lower and the sea outside roared like something ancient and hungry, Maria Theresa understood the truth: her body was not her own. It belonged to France now. At dawn, the linen would be examined. The Queen's women would carry it to the Great Hall, still damp, a flag of national pride. Courtiers would nod approvingly, ambassadors would write reports to Madrid and Rome. the ritual would be deemed successful. And Maria Theresa, barely 16, would begin a lifetime of silence. Because for royal brides of France, the wedding night was never a promise of love. It was an ordeal of humiliation, sanctified by tradition, witnessed by hundreds, and whispered about for centuries. But this was only the beginning. The Bourbons would turn this ceremony into a political weapon, one that stripped young women of their privacy, their dignity, and sometimes their sanity. And behind the golden curtains of Versailles, those who survived the night often discovered that marriage to the King of France could be a fate worse than death. By 1668, 8 years had passed since the Sun King's first night with his queen, and Versailles had begun to rise, a glittering monster of marble, gold, and mirrors. But beneath that brilliance lay a darkness that few dared to name. Louis XIV had transformed the act of sleeping into an act of state. The royal bed became not a symbol of intimacy, but a stage of power. Every morning, the lever du roi, the royal waking, and every night, the coucher du roi, the royal bedtime, became official ceremonies. Hundreds of nobles would gather just to watch the king rise, dress, and retire to bed. The same ritual that had once humiliated a teenage bride was now performed daily, choreographed to display authority in its most intimate form. Versailles was not a palace. It was a theater, and the king, its only star. But what the courtiers didn't know was that, within this theater, dozens of young women lived in quiet dread. Every royal marriage that followed the Sun Kings became a repetition of that same cruel choreography. The chosen brides were often children of politics, princesses raised to smile, bow, and bleed for treaties. Behind their lessons in etiquette were whispered instructions: how to appear modest but fertile, how to keep your eyes down when the curtain of the bed was drawn back, how not to cry when the room filled with spectators. In 1671, a new name entered Versailles, Marie Anne of Bavaria, the young bride of the Dauphin, Louis XIV's son. She was 16. Her arrival marked another alliance, another pageant of obedience. Her wedding night, held within the Queen's apartments, followed the Bourbon script perfectly. The courtiers filed in, bishops, noblemen, duchesses, all perfumed and smiling as if attending a play. The king himself appeared, dressed in white, carrying the royal blessing. The girl curtsied, trembling. The Dauphin looked down, red-faced and silent. He was barely 17, terrified not of his wife, but of his father watching. 2 maids prepared the bed. The linen was inspected by the Queen's ladies, then the royal physician entered with a solemn nod. It was said he could tell a woman's virtue by the tension in her pulse, a grotesque parody of science. When the couple lay down, the crowd recited prayers. Then, as before, the curtains closed and the courtiers exited. But not all. According to one chambermaid's diary, a select few remained near the doorway, listening. The sounds of nervous laughter, a gasp, a whispered command. Then silence. At dawn, the linen ritual returned. White cloth, stained proof. The court applauded. France rejoiced. And somewhere in that crowd, Marie Anne's hands were folded so tightly her nails drew blood. This was what they called virtue. By the 1680s, the practice had become institutionalized. Even illegitimate royal marriages required witnesses. The idea of privacy was dismissed as vulgar. The bedroom was now an instrument of diplomacy. Inside Versailles, rooms were built around the royal bed as if orbiting a sacred altar. The chamber du roi, located at the geometric center of the palace, was designed so that all paths led to it. The symbolism was deliberate, the bed was the sun, and every subject revolved around the king's body. But if Louis XIV's bed was the center of the universe, his queen's bed was a prison. Maria Theresa, once the trembling girl from Spain, now lay ill and forgotten in her gilded chambers. The king had turned his affection to mistresses, Louise de la Valliere, then Madame de Montespan, women who learned that pleasure at court was as dangerous as innocence. Every royal woman, from queens to courtesans, was trapped in the same ritual, watched, weighed, whispered about. A single rumor about a stained sheet or a barren womb could destroy a life. In 1683, when Maria Theresa died at the age of 44, her last words were said to have been, "I have been loved only once, and even that was not for myself." 2 months later, Louis secretly married Madame de Maintenon, his pious mistress. This time, there was no ceremony, no witnesses. The Sun King had grown tired of public rituals. But the damage was done. What had started as a medieval superstition, the display of a bride's purity, had become a weapon of surveillance, humiliation, and control. Every royal girl who entered Versailles after Maria Theresa's death knew what awaited her. The whisper of silk, the smell of wax, the crowd of faces, and the knowledge that even her most private moment belonged to the state. As one court chronicler wrote in 1685, "In France, the bed of the king is not where love begins. It is where freedom ends." Versailles was silent for the first time in more than 70 years. The Sun King was dead. The golden corridors that once trembled with the shuffle of courtiers now echoed with whispers about what came next. The boy who would inherit the throne, Louis XV, was only 5 years old. And while the regents argued over power, another ritual waited patiently, as if written into France's bloodstream, the test of the royal bride. By the time Louis XV reached marriageable age, the custom of inspecting a princess's body had become a grotesque science. The church called it le devoir conjugal, the conjugal duty. Physicians called it proof of legitimacy. But for the young women sent to France, it was simply terror disguised as ceremony. In 1725, Europe buzzed with gossip. The king would marry Marie Leszczyńska, a Polish princess of good manners and questionable fortune. She was 22, older than most royal brides, quiet, devout, and painfully modest. France needed a queen, not for love but for heirs. When Marie arrived at Fontainebleau, she was met not with kindness, but with an inspection. The queen's physician, Dr. Bavard, performed what he called a preliminary examination. Under the pretense of ensuring the princess's health, he and a confessor confirmed her chastity. Witnesses noted her tears, though no one dared to write the details. In France, virtue was not a feeling. It was a document, signed and sealed by men. The wedding took place in September 1725. The ceremony was lavish, but the bride's smile was frozen. When night fell, the ritual began, again, before witnesses. The royal bed, covered in white silk embroidered with gold lilies, awaited its purpose. Marie Leszczyńska knelt beside it as the Bishop of Soissons blessed the sheets. Courtiers filled the chamber like shadows, ministers, noble ladies, even servants. Louis XV was 15, pale and visibly trembling. At a signal, the priest's voice rose. "Let the union of our sovereign and his queen be fruitful in sons and pleasing to God." The crowd echoed "Amen," and the couple was led to the bed. Curtains closed. The door shut. Silence. Outside, they waited. After midnight, a valet emerged. The sheets were carried away, folded carefully, reverently, and brought to the king's aunt, who confirmed what the realm demanded to know. The next morning, Versailles erupted in celebration. Trumpets, cannons, prayers. France had its queen, and her purity had been proven. But the truth inside the chamber was less divine. Louis, shy and unprepared, had whispered apologies through the ordeal. Marie, humiliated, never forgot that her first night as queen had been a performance for the state. In private, she once confided to her confessor. "They say I am a wife. I feel like a sacrifice." As the years passed, the so-called science of purity deepened. Royal physicians began recording the fertility cycles of queens, keeping detailed notes of conjugal encounters. Sheets were counted, timing was observed, and if a pregnancy didn't occur, priests whispered about divine punishment. In 1737, a court midwife wrote in her private letters, "We study their bodies as if they are maps of fortune. Yet not one of us asks what it feels like to be charted." By mid-century, the monarchy had perfected humiliation into bureaucracy. Every bride who married into the Bourbon bloodline faced the same rituals: medical inspection, ceremonial bedding, public verification. Even the private act of giving birth was transformed into a royal event. Queens delivered children surrounded by ministers, courtiers, and servants, witnesses required to ensure legitimacy. When Marie Lesksinska gave birth to her first son in 1729, more than 200 people were in the room. Curtains were tied open. The queen screamed while courtiers jotted notes about her endurance. Not even the royal womb was private. The irony, of course, was that Louis XV, once the trembling boy beneath those linen sheets, would grow into a man infamous for his mistresses. While the queen lived quietly in her apartments, he built hidden chambers in Versailles and later in the Parc aux Cerfs, where young women were selected, inspected, and trained for his pleasure. The same ritual that once ensured a queen's honor now served the king's desire. The test of purity became a tool of indulgence. By 1750, France had convinced itself that morality could be measured by control. The church preached obedience, the physicians enforced it, and the palace turned it into theater. But the silence beneath those rituals was beginning to tremble. The Enlightenment had arrived, and with it, voices that questioned whether virtue could truly exist under surveillance. One philosopher, observing the court in 1749, wrote in secret, "They call it grace, but it is cruelty. No beast is watched so closely as a queen of France." By the middle of the 18th century, France had perfected the art of breaking its daughters long before their wedding nights. In the royal households of the Bourbons, innocence was no longer a gift, it was an expectation written into every lesson, every whisper, every prayer. From the moment a girl could stand straight and curtsy, her life became an education in fear. 1755, Versailles. In a quiet corridor of the palace, a governess named Madame de Marsan lectured a group of young princesses, daughters of Louis XV, on the sacred duties of womanhood. You must be silent when spoken to. You must obey when touched. You must never question what God ordains through your husband. The youngest, Princess Louise, was only 8. Her eyes wide, her hands clasped too tightly for a child. Across the room stood her sister, Marie Adelaide, 16 and already aware of what those words meant. They had watched their mother, Queen Marie Leszczyńska, fade into a ghost. Once a queen of Europe, now a quiet figure who rarely left her chapel. Her husband's infidelities were common knowledge, his mistresses had titles, servants, and gilded rooms of their own. The queen had none of those things. Only dignity, and silence. When the princesses asked why their mother always prayed alone, the governess replied, "Because she failed to please the king." That was the lesson of Versailles, virtue without pleasure meant nothing. A wife's purity mattered only until her usefulness ended. To prepare royal daughters for marriage, the church oversaw a curriculum that blended religion with submission. Girls were taught about the duties of the marital bed, through coded metaphors, flowers, candles, divine union, but the message was always the same: your body is not your own. Some resisted. Most broke quietly. In 1769, a 15-year-old Austrian archduchess named Maria Antonia began receiving lessons in French language and etiquette. Her tutors in Vienna called her graceful, naive, and distractible. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, had already chosen her future husband, the Dauphin of France, grandson of Louis XV. It would be the alliance of empires, sealed once again in a bedchamber. In April 1770, when the young archduchess crossed the Rhine to become Marie Antoinette, she was ceremonially stripped of her Austrian clothes, jewelry, even her underwear. Naked beneath the gaze of French courtiers, she was redressed in Parisian silk. The symbolism was brutal but clear: her old life was over. She would now belong to France. That evening, the king himself presented her to her future husband, Louis Auguste, a timid, awkward boy of 15. The two exchanged words barely above a whisper. Courtiers recorded every glance, every blush, as if the future of the monarchy depended on it, and in a way, it did. Their wedding took place at Versailles on May 16, 1770. 1,000 candles, golden altars, music echoing through the marble halls. But what followed that night was not celebration. It was the oldest Bourbon tradition, the bedding ceremony. The crowd entered the newlyweds' room. The king led them to the bed, smiling proudly. The young couple knelt while priests chanted Latin blessings. Then, before hundreds of watching eyes, the two were ordered to lie down together. Marie Antoinette's face burned crimson, Louis Auguste looked ready to faint. Curtains were drawn. The courtiers lingered. Some laughed quietly, others whispered prayers. And then, silence. When dawn came, there was no proof to show. The sheets were untouched. The court murmured. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. And still, nothing. The rumors began instantly. The Dauphin was mocked as impotent, the young bride pitied, then ridiculed. The doctors whispered of nerves, of youth, of divine timing, but everyone knew what it meant. A queen who could not prove her womanhood was no queen at all. Marie Antoinette's letters from this period reveal the quiet horror of her early years. I am told to wait. To pray. To smile. But each night I feel as though I am on display in a cage made of silk. Her mother, far away in Vienna, wrote with icy precision. Do not fail, Antonia. France is watching. It would take 7 years before the marriage was consummated. 7 years of gossip, humiliation, and whispered jokes in salons across Europe. During those years, Marie Antoinette learned the cruel arithmetic of Versailles: silence equals survival. She smiled more brightly, danced more elegantly, and learned to laugh at her own shame before others could. By the time she became queen in 1774, she had mastered the mask, but never forgotten the ritual that had haunted her youth. The education of royal daughters was never about knowledge. It was about conditioning them to accept their own degradation as destiny. Behind every golden mirror in Versailles, generations of women had been taught the same lesson: obedience is purity, fear is virtue, and pain is holy. But soon, the world outside those walls would begin to change, and the same nation that once cheered the stained sheets of its queens would turn against the very idea of monarchy itself. Versailles smelled of lilies and candle wax the night the new king was proclaimed. Louis XV was dead. His grandson, now Louis XVI, stood pale and trembling before the court. Beside him, Marie Antoinette, just 19, the Austrian bride who had spent years under the gaze of 1,000 judging eyes. The courtiers knelt. The orchestra played. And yet, in the faces that surrounded her, Marie Antoinette saw no reverence, only calculation. She was no longer the timid girl brought to France in a gilded carriage. She was a queen now. But her crown rested on a foundation of whispers. For 7 years, Versailles had mocked her silence. Now that the marriage was finally consummated, it celebrated her fertility as if she were livestock that had finally bred. Ministers announced the completion of royal union in official bulletins. Songs were composed. Coins minted. The Queen of France had fulfilled her duty. But inside, something had shifted. The night the bells rang over Paris to announce her first pregnancy in 1778, Marie Antoinette wept, not from joy, but exhaustion. She knew what awaited her, a public birth, observed by ministers, midwives, and servants, to confirm that the future heir was truly born of royal blood. April 1778. The Queen's bedchamber filled with more than 200 witnesses. Some climbed on furniture just to see. The air was stifling, the heat unbearable. Marie Antoinette fainted mid-labor, her body collapsing beneath the weight of centuries of expectations. When she awoke, she asked for air. The courtiers refused to leave. A child's cry pierced the suffocating silence. France had an heir. And the people outside the palace cheered, never knowing that their queen lay half-conscious in her own blood. The ritual of the royal bed had survived into the age of reason. The Enlightenment questioned the heavens, philosophers dissected morality, yet the monarchy clung to its ancient obsessions: purity, spectacle, control. Marie Antoinette became both symbol and prisoner. By her mid-20s, she had learned to manipulate the stage she'd been forced to perform on. If they would watch her, she decided, then she would direct what they saw. She turned her private life into theater, garden parties, masquerades, the famous Petit Trianon. The same eyes that once sought proof of her virtue now watched for proof of her corruption. Pamphlets flooded Paris accusing her of adultery, greed, witchcraft, and worse. Her Austrian heritage became a curse. They called her l'Autrichienne, the Austrian woman, a slur that would later twist into l'Autrichienne, the other bitch. She had been crowned beneath gold and light, but every day since, she lived under an invisible scaffold. The diamond necklace affair. A scandal she did not cause, but which sealed her fate. A forged correspondence, a stolen necklace, a public trial, and once again, the Queen's body became a matter of national obsession. Writers described her skin, her perfume, her alleged lovers. The same court that once celebrated her innocence now demanded her shame. In pamphlets sold on Parisian streets, crude illustrations showed the queen naked in bed, a perverse echo of the old wedding night rituals. Her enemies no longer needed priests or doctors to inspect her virtue. The people themselves had taken over the role. When revolution came in 1789, Versailles fell quiet again. The crowds outside were not courtiers now, they were starving citizens. And they remembered those beds, those feasts, those rituals of silk and gold. They remembered the girl who had once symbolized the excess of kings. October 5, 1789, the Women's March on Versailles. Thousands of Parisian women stormed the palace, demanding bread and justice. They broke through the queen's chambers, tore the curtains, shattered mirrors, and trampled the embroidered linens that once displayed royal purity. Marie Antoinette fled barefoot through secret passages, her white gown streaked with mud. The ritual had ended, violently, decisively. But its ghost would follow her all the way to the scaffold. The Conciergerie prison, Paris. The queen, now 37, sat in a grey cell that smelled of damp stone. Her once golden hair had turned white. The guards called her Widow Capet. On October 16, they came for her. She stood tall, her spine unbroken. The mob outside roared her name, not in reverence, but in hatred. As she was led to the guillotine, a priest murmured the traditional marriage blessing, mocking her final walk. The blade that once symbolized the sword of the king would now end the monarchy forever. But Marie Antoinette did not cry. She stepped onto the scaffold, looked at the crowd, and said, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to do it." After stepping on the executioner's foot, her final act of grace. A few seconds later, the blade fell. For the first time in centuries, France no longer owned a woman's body. The ritual of humiliation, born in the beds of kings, preserved in the chambers of queens, died on that bloodied wooden stage. The courtiers who once inspected linen now inspected the guillotine. The people who once cheered royal births now cheered royal deaths. But history, cruel as it is, rarely kills its ghosts. The myth of the perfect bride, the obedient wife, the silent queen, it survived long after Versailles turned to dust. The sound of the guillotine still echoed through Europe like a church bell from hell. Kings watched from their palaces as France bled its monarchy dry, and yet, behind closed doors, the same old ritual survived. In Madrid, Vienna, and even London, royal families whispered to each other, "We must not end up like France." But the lesson they took was not humility. It was control. They hid the ceremonies, cloaked them in privacy and prayer, but the meaning was the same, the purity of women as the foundation of empires. In Spain, the Bourbons who had once ruled from Versailles' shadows now ruled from Madrid's marble halls. In 1802, Maria Antonia of Naples, a young princess, married Ferdinand VII. The court physician recorded in his notes that the king demanded the wedding sheets be examined the next morning, a practice inherited directly from the French court. The royal ladies carried the linen in procession through the corridors of the palace, folded on a silver tray, under a lace veil. The document describing it was filed in the archives of the royal household under the title, Certification de la Noche Nuptial. Even as revolution burned across Europe, the idea that a woman's worth could be proved by the state of a bedsheet refused to die. Meanwhile, in Austria, the Habsburgs buried their daughters beneath layers of etiquette and piety. The Empress's handbooks for conduct still included entire chapters on the preparation of the bride. It instructed: she must be examined for health, educated in devotion, and delivered to her husband as pure as the host upon the altar. For every Marie Antoinette who perished in defiance, there were 10 princesses who lived and died in obedience. In Vienna, 1810, the Empire arranged a new alliance to heal the old wound. Archduchess Marie-Louise, the great-niece of Marie Antoinette, would marry the man who had destroyed her aunt's world, Napoleon Bonaparte. It was supposed to symbolize peace between France and Austria. But once again, peace came at the price of a girl's body. Marie-Louise was 18. She had never met her husband. On the eve of her wedding, the Austrian court ordered the same old rites. The Empress's physicians examined her health and virginity. The results were signed by 2 archduchesses and sealed with imperial wax. When she crossed the border into France, history repeated itself like a curse. At Compiègne, she was stripped of her Austrian gown and jewels, redressed in French silk, and presented to Napoleon. The next morning, the imperial household in Paris confirmed, through official declaration, that the marriage had been consummated. The newspapers printed the news as if it were a military victory. France has triumphed in bed as it has triumphed on the battlefield. The Enlightenment had promised reason. The 19th century had promised progress. Yet monarchies continued to sanctify humiliation as tradition. Even in England, a land that claimed to be civilized and modern, echoes of the same cruelty persisted. When Queen Caroline of Brunswick married George IV in 1795, witnesses were ordered to remain within earshot of the bedchamber. George, disgusted by his bride, drank himself senseless. The next day he told his courtiers that the act had been performed, and the marriage declared complete. Caroline later wrote in her diary, "It was like dying with my eyes open." Her humiliation didn't end there. In 1820, when George tried to divorce her, the government held public hearings about her private life. The evidence? The king's men argued that because she had not been faithful in body, she had forfeited her right to be queen. Once again, the same courtroom language that had shamed French brides was revived in London, only now the spectators were the entire British public. Across Europe, the thrones trembled, but the rules for women remained unchanged. From 1793 to 1848, revolutions rose and fell, but in palaces, the daughters of kings were still being weighed like currency. Their bodies brokered alliances, sealed peace, and silenced wars. What changed was the stage. The ritual moved from candlelit chambers to medical rooms, from priests to physicians, from courtiers to bureaucrats. But the obsession stayed the same: proof. Proof of virginity. Proof of obedience. Proof of submission. A French historian writing in 1845 summarized the hypocrisy in one bitter line: "We killed our kings, but not their customs." By then, Europe had seen too many crowns fall to count. Napoleon's empire had burned out, the Bourbons had returned and fallen again, and yet, behind the closed doors of every surviving dynasty, from Vienna to Madrid, the golden beds remained. They were relics of a world that refused to die. The queens who endured them left behind no diaries, no confessions. Their silence became their legacy. The linen that once testified to their virtue turned to dust in palace vaults, but the shame was passed on, invisible, unspoken, inherited. Because empires do not die in revolutions. They die in the hearts of the women who can no longer bear to live by their rules. Spring, 1848. Europe burned again. Kings fled their palaces dressed as commoners, thrones toppled, and the crowds in Paris sang of liberty where once they had bowed. The last echo of the Bourbon name vanished beneath the roar of a republic. But inside the ruins of royal Europe, a quieter transformation began. The age of revolutions had promised freedom, yet in the drawing rooms of the new aristocracy, the myths of obedience and purity returned, polished, romanticized, stripped of their cruelty. The golden beds that had witnessed humiliation became museum pieces, their stains erased by history's polite silence. In 1855, the Château de Versailles opened its restored rooms to the public. Tourists wandered through the Queen's chambers, marveling at the gilded bed where Marie Antoinette had given birth, where Maria Theresa had wept, where so many had been made royal by force of ritual. The guides spoke softly, their words sweetened for Victorian ears. Here, love was sanctified by the church and witnessed by the court. They did not mention the linen, or the fear, or the trembling hands of girls barely 16. In Vienna, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi, rebelled in her own quiet way. She refused to let courtiers watch her dress, banned priests from her chamber, and demanded to travel without attendants. "I will not live as my mother lived," she told her lady-in-waiting in 1860. Yet even her defiance was confined within gold frames and etiquette manuals. In Madrid, the young Isabella II inherited the throne and with it the same old expectations. Her wedding night was documented by doctors, her pregnancies monitored by priests. The empire had changed flags, but not habits. The 19th century worshipped progress, railways, telegraphs, steam, but behind palace doors, it preserved the same language of possession. A woman's virtue was still measured by silence, her worth by obedience. By the 1880s, writers began to dig up the forgotten scandals of Versailles and turn them into fiction. The pain of those women became entertainment. Parisian salons whispered about the secret nights of queens. Painters imagined pale brides reclining on velvet beds, candlelight flickering over their skin. Poets called it romance. The ritual of shame had become art. In London, museums displayed the wedding portraits of royal couples beneath plaques that praised dynastic unity. Schoolgirls studied queens who served their nations through devotion. The truth, the fear, the surveillance, the humiliation, was locked away with the rest of the royal linens in sealed archives. But history has a strange way of whispering through cracks. In 1894, a French historian named Henri de Mesnil discovered an archive in the cellars of Versailles, hundreds of folded linen records labeled preuves de noces, proofs of marriage. The oldest dated back to 1620, the newest to 1770. Each one signed by witnesses, priests, and physicians. Each one a monument to a single night of a woman's life. De Mesnil published his findings, and France reacted with embarrassed fascination. The newspapers printed illustrations of the royal bed ceremony, calling it a curious custom of our ancestors. Some laughed. Others were horrified. Few realized that those sheets told the story of every queen who had lived and died beneath them. By the turn of the century, the world had changed beyond recognition. Electricity hummed through the walls of Parisian homes. Steamships crossed oceans. The Eiffel Tower rose over a republic that had long since buried its kings. And yet, in the glittering salons of the Belle Époque, women still lived beneath invisible crowns. They were no longer inspected by priests or courtiers, but by gossip, by beauty, by reputation. The names had changed, the ritual had not. Because the royal bed was never truly about royalty. It was about control. The power to decide what a woman could be. To define her worth through her body. To turn fear into virtue and silence into honor. The monarchy may have fallen, but its shadow lingered over every marriage contract, every confession, every whispered judgment in polite society. Even now, when you walk through the halls of Versailles, the air feels heavy. The mirrors reflect more than faces, they reflect ghosts. You can almost hear the rustle of silk, the faint murmur of Latin prayers, the clinking of silver trays. They built a museum to display their glory, but what it really holds is their guilt. The young queens who smiled for portraits, the brides who were stripped and examined, the mothers who gave birth before hundreds of eyes, they never left. Their stories seeped into the marble, into the velvet, into the quiet. History polished them into saints or monsters. But they were neither. They were simply human. And perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all, that the most powerful women in Europe were never allowed to own even a single moment of their own lives. The thrones have crumbled. The crowns lie forgotten. But the ritual, the hunger to witness, to possess, to judge, still hides within us. The palace may have fallen. But the museum of silence remains.